What's up guys, Noah here and welcome to Book of Showtime chapter 57. As always, if you guys enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like and share with your friends, and if you have a topic you'd like for me to cover for Book of Showtime, be sure to leave it in the comment section down below, or any you can reach me on social media or the Book of Showtime Discord. So recently I decided that I wanted to look at doing more focused or themed subchapters, but I decided that I wanted to keep the subchapters consistent with their format of reviewing comments and adding on to previous chapters, or covering concepts that never made it into a full video. I figured that the best way to go about demonstrating this was to devote an entire chapter to Resident Evil. Yeah, this is a pretty self-indulgent chapter. I gathered questions from friends in the community, so let's just jump right in. If you're a fan of Resident Evil, this is the chapter for you. So Venetia first asked, which game would you recommend a newcomer to the series play first? Well, I've always said that Resident Evil Revelations is the way to go, but in recent years I feel you can really jump right in at Resident Evil 7 and not miss anything. I felt Revelations' pacing and solid middle ground between old Resident Evil isolation and claustrophobia mixed with the modern controls made it a great game to play if you never touched the Resident Evil. But saying it out loud, Resident Evil 7 has many of the same features. The pacing is obviously a little different in terms of stopping point to stopping point. In Revelations, you have the game broken up into chapters, but in Resident Evil 7, there's no chapters, just objectives. If you ever want to pitch Resident Evil to somebody, Revelations or Resident Evil 7, those are the games to do it. Resident Evil 7 Gold Edition you can probably find for about 20 bucks. Resident Evil Revelations, that's probably much cheaper than 20 bucks. So yeah, those are perfect games for people to get into. Venetia then says, Resident Evil 8 had werewolves and vampires. What other folklore creatures would you like to see a biohazard spin on? I'm actually going to sort of dodge Venetia's question a bit here and go a different route, because I'm not really up to date on all my folklore. I mean, might like to see like a yeti or something. I don't know my folklore that much, but I would actually love to see Resident Evil delve more into paranormal entities. I always felt Resident Evil was a game that was never truly scary, but in recent years they've worked hard to conjure up some creepy sections that always had a bit of a paranormal vibe to them. But imagine Capcom just said, listen, let's just go all in. Let's send the BSAA ghost hunting. Like, you know how Resident Evil 4 was going to be very paranormal? It had the Hookman demo, you guys remember that? Imagine having to use different tactics as a means for the various types of ghosts that exist. You know, Onryos, yokais, demons, shades, all that. That would be pretty neat. Vinny then goes on to ask top 5 sexiest Resident Evil characters. Out of all the questions that I received, not from Vinny, but from everybody for this mailbag, this was kind of the hardest, or rather, it was the one that took the longest. I put way too much time into thinking about this top 5. I don't think a lot of the Resident Evil characters have eye-popping sex appeal. A lot of these characters are very, very attractive, but the games don't really tend to put them in like revealing outfits or anything. Plus, it's a horror game. The libido is kind of turned off when I'm playing. I get some shrinkage during these games, man. It'd be intense. But no, in no order, I have to start with Ada. Ada, she never had like the biggest bust, the widest hips, but I always felt, especially in Resident Evil, the original Resident Evil 4, she had a tremendous figure. She's in excellent shape, looks amazing in every game, except Resident Evil 6. She didn't look too good there, but to be fair, nobody did. But that's what I liked about Ada. She's a very dangerous, she had dangerous curves. Number 2, Sheva, who is just to me one of the most attractive characters in gaming, not just Resident Evil. I don't know what it is, but just seeing her face fills me with joy, and we need her on the Resident Evil engine bad. Like that's one of the reasons I still play Resident Evil 5, is just because of Sheva. Next, I'm gonna say Ashley, who I didn't care much for in the original Resident Evil 4, but in the remake, I think she's amazing, and I also think the way she sits when you're in the shooting gallery is really cute. Number 4, I'm gonna throw a dude in there, you know, add some variety, you know, for all the queers and the femmes out there. I'm gonna go with Wesker. And what adds to Wesker's sexiness, you know, he has a great voice. Always thought he was a great talker. Him and his sister, they're great talkers. He has the shades, he has great hair, and he's probably, out of all the Resident Evil characters, the best dressed. He always has some drip on, he looks fly, you know, Chris, Leon, everybody else, they gotta take notes. Wesker, he always shows up. Now, he's doing some evil. If you can get past the fact that he wants to exterminate the human race for just a few seconds and look at his outfits, you'd be like, all right, hold on, he got it on. And finally, number 5, which you guys know me, you knew this was coming, Jill Valentine, which requires no explanation. This is the peak white women hours now on Book of Showtime. She's perfect. She's perfect, and that's why she hasn't shown up much over the last decade. Capcom knows she's too powerful. You put her on the RE engine, she's too hot. She would accelerate global warming faster than Taylor Swift is doing. Finally, Vinny asked, what are some of the top changes you'd like to see for a Resident Evil 5 remake? So it's inevitable at this point that we get a Resident Evil 5 remake, and after recently finishing it for about the 3000th time, I think there's a lot of changes they can make to the core gameplay. I finished Resident Evil 5 about 2 weeks ago, and it's really starting to show its age. Even when I played it last year, I was like, this is kind of getting to the point where it's really not fun and it's more of a chore. I know I've said in the past that playing Resident Evil 5 is like a rite of passage of being my friends, but will you guys maybe settle for Time Splitters Future Perfect or a lot of Call of Duty Zombie sessions? Because Resident Evil 5, it's not it anymore. I think a huge change Capcom could make, and this might be tricky, but when you play Dead Space 3 solo, your co-op partner isn't there. It only shows up when it's important. Now, doing this for Resident Evil 5 would mean they would basically have to make 2 games, but honestly, why not? They'd have to really remake a ton of the game, but I think that would be a welcome addition. Or maybe if they ever make a 3rd Revelations game, which, by the way, did you guys ever see that report that there's like 5 Resident Evil games in development? Obviously, one of them is 9, one of them has to be the 5 remake, and one of them has to be Revelations 3. You know, if they ever did a 3rd Revelations game, that could be a component where the game is drastically different based on if you're playing with someone or by yourself. I think that would also help with keeping the game scary. If you ever played a horror game solo versus with somebody, it's very different. You take away a lot of the horror when you add in co-op. One of the key features I've always spoken about on Book of Showtime when it comes to horror is that feeling of loneliness, just being by yourself all the time. It just makes you feel vulnerable, you know? So when you have somebody watching your back, you just don't get that. Next up, I think they should retain a lot of the mechanics that made Resident Evil 4 Remake good and keep in the side missions and also the way you upgrade your weapons, the parrying, all those little things that just made the game so fun. Keep all those things in. And finally, I think that there should be individual differences between playing as Sheva or Chris besides animations. I think Chris should be able to do things, use weapons, get to places that Sheva can't, and vice versa. Think about how Rebecca and Billy worked in Resident Evil 0. Each of them can do the same general basic things, but there's a couple of little things Rebecca could do that Billy couldn't, and there's a few things that Billy could do that Rebecca couldn't. There's a bit of a brains and brawn dynamic, which I think added to the game's like science, the science of playing a Resident Evil. So moving on to my friend Zorky, he first asked, is your favorite Resident Evil game the same one you have played the most, and if not, what makes it less replayable than your favorite? This is a really good question and one I don't have a true definitive answer to. The original Resident Evil 4 is my all-time favorite, that's undisputed, and I played it a few times on GameCube, then a few times on PS2, then a few times on the Nintendo Wii, then about a dozen times on Xbox 360, including 3 times in the summer of 2015. I was going crazy on the Resident Evils. Then PC and Xbox One, I think twice each, then the Switch once, and obviously over time, the more I play it, the shorter the runs get. This isn't even considering assignment 8 of runs, separate ways, mercenaries, you know, all that bonus stuff. Now, after saying all that, you might be thinking, nor how is it even in doubt? Resident Evil 4 is your most played game, it's your favorite game. Well, Resident Evil 5. I finished Resident Evil 5 well over 30 times with about 11 different partners. This isn't even counting my solo runs, DLC, versus mode, achievement hunting, treasure boosting, or all the time I spent on mercenaries in this game. I played mercenaries way more in 5 than I did in 4. So, in all honesty, it's probably a lot closer than you imagine, a lot closer than I would personally like, but I think overall Resident Evil 4 is my most played as my favorite game. The main reason that I've played Resident Evil 5 so much is clearly the co-op. If the game didn't have co-op, you can take away those 30 runs with the 11 partners. You could take away the versus mode, all the achievement hunting, the treasure boosting, all that stuff. You could take all of it away. I probably would have just played the game maybe in the neighborhood of 8 or 9 times. Who knows? But it definitely wouldn't have been over 30. Next up, Zorky asked, what changes did Resident Evil 6 need to make to be a good Resident Evil game? This is also a good question, as Resident Evil 6, aside from characters and lore, really had no traits of what I see as a Resident Evil, which, you know, is an isolated, claustrophobic, tense situation where you have to play for the current situation and the future, or technically a survival horror game. You know, it was very focused on the action and just being an over-the-top Capcom game, which, listen, Resident Evil 6 at its core is it's a fun game. It's a really, really fun game. In fact, I enjoyed it a lot more than 5 at this point, just for the smoothness of the way the game handles. The changes Resident Evil 6 would have to make to be a good Resident Evil game would essentially require a complete overhaul. You'd have to strip the co-op first, okay? You have to contain the game to a smaller setting as opposed to the globe-trotting affair that we experienced. And then from that, just focus on tension and puzzle solving. And let me make one thing clear. The puzzle solving in Resident Evil isn't just limited to moving statues around or finding out what order to click buttons. It's the science that Capcom puts into designing games where you have a limited inventory and you're facing down the unknown. Do you burn your good supplies now, or do you save it for these hypothetical situations that might happen? Have you ever finished a survival horror game with a ton of supplies and it's like, man, I could have made my job a lot easier early on? That's what made Resident Evil games so special. That mystery, those hard questions, the games themselves were puzzles. That's the Resident Evil I love. Finally, Zach asks, do you ever want to see another mode like Raid mode from Revelations 2, or is Mercenaries the ideal post-game content, or some sort of hybrid of them? You know, a hybrid of those would be fantastic, especially if that leads to a proper survival or horde type mode in Resident Evil. You get a little bit of that in Raid mode, but it's set waves as opposed to just pure endurance like in Call of Duty. The Mercenaries in Resident Evil 8 seems a little more non-traditional than most mercenary modes, and I think that could be a sign of Capcom looking to change things up. I was actually shocked that we didn't get any bonus content on disc for Resident Evil 7, and the Nightmare mode was awesome. The fact that it all dropped a week later, though, it just didn't sit right with me, but I'm getting off track. Now, Raid mode so far has been exclusive to Revelations games, and I wouldn't be mad if that's how it stayed. But more variety in the bonus modes, like with what Resident Evil 7 did with banned footage, I'm very open to it. As of this recording, I've actually yet to touch Resident Evil 4 Mercenaries mode. I know, how is that possible? I just haven't, okay? Maybe one day I'll stream it to the Discord. Moving on, my brother Nicholas first asked, most well-designed boss in the franchise, mechanically and thematically for the game. So this is actually a rather tough one. Most Resident Evil games have about half a dozen bosses with all types of gimmicks and themes, but I really think the best fight for mechanics and theme has to be the Jack Baker chainsaw fight in Resident Evil 7, because that just captures the series and Capcom in a nutshell. It's so silly and over the top, but it's also grounded and super scary too, because why does Jack have that type of device laying around? Like, what do you, it's not even like it's some type of super weed whacker or something like that. The dude just said two. Have you ever played Warhammer Space Marine? He had like the chain sword. He just put two of those together. It's like, why does he have that lying around? Like, who is bro's ops that he needs that? Nicholas then goes on to say Resident Evil has gained mass appeal over the past couple of years. Do you see the remakes as a detriment, being that fundamentally they're a retread of old ground? This is a very good question and might be polarizing my answer a little bit, but you know, the remakes are good for the generation of fans post Resident Evil 7. But for someone like me that grew up religiously playing the originals, my bar personally for the remakes is a lot higher. I felt Resident Evil 2's remake had some minor design issues, and while Resident Evil 3 was still a solid game, it A, did not live up to its massive potential, or B, preserved the legacy of the original. I'm aware the game was developed at the same time as Resident Evil 2, but there's just this feeling that they made the game in response to how well Resident Evil 2's remake did. I apologize though, I actually dodged your question. I would say no, as all the new fans would probably love to experience the stories of old, but the sad reality is that the older Resident Evil games are probably unplayable if you didn't grow up on them, so having the remakes is important to making newer fans feel more involved in the story. He then goes on to say, why is Ethan the Giga Chad #1 dad? I wouldn't say he's the #1 dad. I think Kratos, Kiryu, Chuck Green, they all clear him. Yes, I said Chuck Green, argue with a wall, but he is a pretty dedicated father and husband, because look, in Resident Evil 7, if that was me, I'd be out right after I got my hand chainsawed off. Like, that's it, I'm officially a widow. Maybe Mio is like an elite eater. That's putting it as PG as I can on this channel. Nicholas then says the success of the recent installments of Resident Evil have undoubtedly affected the recently announced Silent Hill title from a gameplay standpoint. While this seems to tonally take away from Silent Hill, do you think the influence is positive? Absolutely. When you have a series like Resident Evil, which pioneered what we know as survival horror, not once, not twice, but 3 times, you will see the influence spread. In fact, just take a look at the state of the genre post Resident Evil 7. Like, the aforementioned Silent Hill remake probably doesn't happen without Resident Evil setting the world on fire. Neither does the Alone in the Dark remake coming up in a couple of weeks, which we've seen in the demo that we covered here, has a ton of Resident Evil DNA from the demo and the eye test alone. How about a game like Daymare? I mean, obviously that has a lot of ties to Resident Evil, but I don't think that happens. Neither does Immortal Legacy or even Alan Wake. All of these games have a touch of Resident Evil in them, and that's all due to Resident Evil 7 bringing back the genre in such a huge way. Finally, Nicholas asks, do you see a return of the single location style of Resident Evils making a comeback? We can just call this the Resident Evil 7 and Friends mailbag, because I feel like so many of these talking points come back to Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 did the Creepy Mansion so perfectly, and I would just love for Resident Evil to just go back to that. I mentioned earlier traits that I expect in a Resident Evil game, and being trapped in a set location like the Baker residence or the Raccoon City police station, it really adds to the feelings of dread, loneliness, and isolation. Just the notion that you're cut off from everyone, you're cut off from the outside, it's very frightening. And finally, my friend Andreas, who actually writes Resident Evil fan fiction, which is not that type of fan fiction, by the way. It's really good. It's a really good retelling of Resident Evil. I'll make sure to leave a link for it down below. He says, what do you think about the bioorganic weapon aspect of Resident Evil lore? The idea that Umbrella was making tyrants and nemesis and hunters for use as military weapons. Didn't Wesker send a tyrant after the STARS unit to gain battle data? How useful would such data even be? Did they really think world governments would want to buy their huge uncontrollable mutants to fight in battle? This is actually a funny question because he's got a point. What would the battle data be? Word of mouth? You know, I played Umbrella Chronicles a couple of times, and Wesker, after he gets killed by a tyrant, he never stops and picks up like a camera or anything. He just leaves before the place blows up. I just imagine Wesker going up to Tricell and saying, look, this tyrant I cooked up, aside from ignoring my orders and killing me, it's very effective. Now, I know it said it killed me, alright? It did kill me. I was dead. I was dead. I'm here now. I was dead. But it did kill me, you know? It killed me pretty good. There's a bit of irony with BOWs as everyone who develops them, you know, they just wind up dying to them. And all the outbreaks and containment failures, it's like maybe just making some super steroids that have mood blockers would be easier. All these bioweapons die to a rocket anyway, which makes them no more durable than a light armor tank. The only time the virus seems formidable as a weapon is when someone injects themselves with the virus. You guys ever notice that in Resident Evil? Like, if somebody gets bit or comes in contact with the virus, they'll just turn into a zombie or whatever. But when someone, like, willingly injects themselves with a virus, especially after they say some cheesy one-liner like, this is the future, and they just turn into, like, a demigod, you know? Did you guys play Revelations? Like, that dude at the end was doing some Naruto ninjutsu nonsense in that fight. Like, bro, make it make sense. Is that how the virus works? Just you inject yourself and, like, okay, I want to become really great. The virus is like, alright, bro, let's do it. Do other people get bitten like, no, I'm gonna be a zombie now, I seen this in the movies, and they just turn into a zombie? Like, come on, Capcom, please. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this chapter. This was a really fun one to do. I would like to do more mailbag videos. Some of them will be variety, some will be focused, but this was a really fun concept, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down below if you have any more Resident Evil questions, because I can always talk about Resident Evil. Inshallah, I will see you in the next chapter.